Hi,
Hello.
everyone. Thank you
Hello.
so much for being here. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for being here.
Okay, so I'm so happy that you guys came, and I'm really grateful to the center as well for setting up this chance for me to get to chat with you guys as we're in lockdown. So I think that how this is going to run is that I'm going to read a very, very short little bit, and then Gina and I will talk, right? Is that right? Okay. So I'll be reading from the new novel Quotients. And you don't really need to know a whole lot going into this because it's the second chapter. Yeah, no, you don't need to know anything else. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead. Jeremy could not move, speak. Happenings were happening too fast, and his mind switched from simple sentences. There was no subject, object, predicate, meaning predicated on simple words, one after the other. He was stuck on 4 syllables. Alexandra. Alexandra held hostage. Alexandra beneath a crush of rubble. 4 syllables with life pulled out from under her. He thought of how he'd never told her. He wanted them to die very old, him first, of course, and holding her hand. He had not even told Alexandra. He wanted to choose paper towels with her. A simile to the moment. In the offices of Strategic Hedge International, the volume of the television, normally tuned to Bloomberg, was turned high. Coffers stood erect before the men. It was tragic, the explosions, he told them. And the lesson from '01 was it was time to execute the list. They must, he said, offload, sell before the fall. Banks and hotels, British Airways, buy up pharma. It is the responsibility owed their investors. Gavin Thomas's hands already maneuvered over his desk. Try again, once, twice, fingers clumsy on his mobile. At Jeremy's ear, this is the sound of not reaching Alexandra. Soon the internet servers failed, and at some point, after it had been confirmed phone lines had gone down, Jeremy heard talking torsos declare normal programming had ceded to breaking news. 1 dead. King's Cross and Russell Square, Old Street, Moorgate, 1 turned to 20, 20 dead. More information is worse news now, someone said. And it was true, Jeremy knew. Jeremy knew breaking news became broken history. New news early in an emergency was a broadcast of provisional facts. Later, they'd shed authority, permute, redetermine, information would redouble. He listened for names, hers. From the flat screen, the police commissioner announced it wasn't coincidence on the underground. It was terror. Jeremy did not need to be told. Around the room, the men of Strategic turned to each other. Speculation shaped their lips. Proximity to the U.S. Embassy at Grosvenor and a dense shopping strip meant that another attack could take them too, or else maybe that was optimistic. Maybe everywhere meant open to the end. In a city of 8 million people, Thomas was saying, consider stats 20 to 8 million. Fact is, good fraction, good odds. But Jeremy could not weigh probabilities. He could only think of the impossible. He once had had the other phone, the one his people had given him, not these numbers to nowhere, buttons that wouldn't reach. He could only think of the impossible, though even if he did have the old phone, even if she were alive to call, she'd be on the regular service, the Feld one. Alexandra couldn't answer on the secure line. She, after all, had never been a spy. Okay, that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you
you so much for your work. Thank you for inviting me to speak to you, and thank you for giving me your novel. Um, I want to start with that. You brought up a section of reading. It's this quote that some people have. It's a novel perfectly attuned to our times. Part thriller, mystery. Um, the quote here: alarming critique of the world we're all living in without most people knowing it. That's in the book list, the starred review of book list. could you talk about that? How you envision this novel in terms of our times? I'm obviously this is not a time that you actually expected, but there's something even about what you read, the sudden crisis point that happens in that very early on in the novel. Um, and I do know this is usually hard. How would you summarize your own novel, and in terms of our times?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a really hard novel for me to summarize to people, but I suppose that what I'll say is that I think underlying this book, I was thinking almost constantly about the notion that most of us are seeking, on some level, a sense of safety and security, but that oftentimes our efforts to create safe homes, safe families, safe relationships does in fact make them less safe. And I was sort of pulling from the zeitgeist and trying to take that sort of structure, that something almost like a maxim, and think of it in this really iterative way. So in the context of quotients, yes, there is safety in terms of questions of global and national security that are related to terrorism. There's the safety or lack of safety that we find in online discourse. There are moments where the characters experience some sort of surveillance that makes them feel unsafe in their just in-person interactions. And I think that right now, a lot of that sense of insecurity comes from many places, but one of the places that it comes from is sort of a fracturing of authority. There's a way in which I think it's often very difficult for us now to disentangle what is information and what is misinformation, who has narrative authority, if, whether that's our government giving us information about coronavirus or, or some other entity. And so, I suppose at this point now, although certainly the book doesn't, address a pandemic, certainly that paranoia, the questions we have about who we can trust and what will make us safe, do feel like they are floating in the zeitgeist.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's so true. The part of the one of the things about the novel that really propels you, is that unstable sense of who has knowledge, who has control, as this couple is trying to create a haven for themselves after, you know, um, you know, I won't go into what their lives are, because I think that's part of the fun of the book. But that I think that point you made about authority and that kind of fracturing, fragmenting, the destabilizing of a sense of, it is also truth. It's about truth, but it's also about trust. And it's also about something kind of systemic out there that's really not that's creating something weird. But my next question is about your particular plot ideas. How did they come to you for this particular novel, for instance? This issue of surveillance, this issue of and the couple. I mean, was that already part of the story, or did they come in later as you were thinking about a topic? Is it more thematic or character driven?
Okay, yeah. So the novel really began with Jeremy's character. Jeremy is well, we were just reading about Jeremy, so I guess people know that he's the main character. So I had met a man who said he had been a spy. And I was sort of interested in what that would mean in the long tail of somebody's life, how that particular experience would follow somebody and be a major influence in the way that they understood social relations, the relationship between perception and reality, what was safe, what wasn't safe. And I knew from the beginning that I would be interested in thinking about how that would affect this character's creation of a family, or their attempt to have a family. This being, sort of the sort of primal and, in the Western world, primary unit, social unit in some ways. So that couple was there from the beginning, essentially. I started writing this book, as I've mentioned in some interviews, it was after this, the Snowden revelations, after some other major events that I think also shifted a lot of people's sense of authority. So I'm thinking about things like the Judith Miller scandal, even to a smaller extent, something like, the Stephen Glass case. And so I was pulling these things from the zeitgeist that had to do with media, with surveillance, with increasingly living our lives online. There wasn't yet necessarily a vocabulary of surveillance capitalism, but there was research that was beginning to be done at that point. And so I was thinking about these questions. At the same time, I was also in this PhD program at Columbia in communications. And so I was, reading a great deal about these things. And I took a lot of inspiration from scholarly work that I came into contact with. So, there are some really small moments in the book that I think you can maybe feel that a little bit. So, there's a part where one character says of the information age, oh, but the world was more spread out then. And that was something that was very much generated in part as a response to the work of Wolfgang Schiebelbausch. I had read a book at some point by a woman named Melissa Aronczyk called Nation Branding. And that was where I got the idea that Alexandra would be a nation brander. There are my dissertation advisor, Andy Tucker, is working on a book about fake news. So, I was really taking a great deal from that. And I think that, when I'm writing a book too, I'm a little bit obsessive. It's always sort of like churning in the back of my brain, even if it seems to not be in my life. And so I'm almost like subconsciously like, magpieing, just picking up things, assimilating them into the novel. Yeah.
I think that's always the fun of being in a novel. I think that fun of there's always a purpose to everything because everything can be used. I think that's an aspect of novel writing that just it just seems like it's always a pleasure to be doing the work because everything matters. Any little thing will allow you to it's part of your work. I'm also interested in in your prose style. I mean, I wonder about whether or not the voice or the sentences or the writing that you want is connected to the structure and the ideas that you come at. So I think I think the style is just beautiful. It's astounding. I call them your sentences are like jujitsu moves. You have the predicate and then the predicate that changes in the same line. So for me as a reader, you're always kind of being thrown off a little bit, and that makes you keep reading. The way your sentences work. So is there a connection between the prose style and the ideas that interest you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I I love the way that you describe that. I think that there's a way in which when I'm intending to a sentence, the grammar to me really needs to create a plot of sorts. And the plot that I'm often trying to enact, and I think especially in this book was trying to enact, is a sense of being maybe unsure a little bit, which you call being sort of like thrown off balance, right? That then moves into a little bit of a stronger sense of meaning. So I'm not, some people I think approach a sentence thinking of it as a fully formed unit. This is the idea that I want to present. And it's sort of thinking about the sentence from the end of it. I'm thinking very much about sentences moving through time. And so that movement through time, that breaking it into much smaller, grammatical spaces, is sort of what generates that sense of being a little bit unsure, or having to reconfigure, rejigger one's brain around it. And I hope that on the one hand, that it is just sort of generally a gesture that asks the reader to slow down a little bit. This book that is about a world that is moving too fast in a lot of ways, where information is being pelted at us all the time. So I'm kind of asking the reader to slow down. But I'm also trying to play with them and, bring them into, in a very sort of subconscious way, that psychology of seeking answers that maybe many of the characters are in too. Yeah.
Right. It's it is interesting. It's like syntax as spy moves. They're like spy moves because you're moving in some way, and you're going to go that way, but there are misdirections, and I think that's powerful because it keeps the reader there. The reader's always there's a task, always like a very clear task for the reader as the reader's reading your novel. It's fascinating. And I did think that the spy moves of the syntax and the spy novel, I loved it. It was great. So, and then of course, I'm going to connect that a little bit to this other piece that I'm interested in. And I think there are connections with those where the spy move that you're making when you're creating sentences has an issue. It's an issue about your own sense of wanting to control. There's a control that you want. And that's kind of part of, as you're destabilizing, it's actually the writer has control over that other person that you're destabilizing, because you're controlling that person. I'm interested in that in terms of your being a woman writer, and in terms of your being an Asian writer. And this, because there is a kind of stereotype of docility, of doing a particular kind of novel. A woman does, all of these things, and your work is it doesn't sit with that passivity, because it requires the reader to be quite active. So how would you think about yourself as a woman and as an Asian writer in terms of the choices that you've made as a writer, as an artist? I mean, are you conscious of going against expectations or not?
It's something that I'm aware of in the background. I'm not sure that how do I put this? I would say that there is a way in which that awareness probably does shape my writing, in the sense that I'm not particularly interested in being a writer who gives a reader what they want all the time.
Right.
And although I think that that can be read as a hostile move, I don't mean it in a hostile way. So when I say that I'm not interested in giving a reader what they want all the time, one thing that I'm thinking about is that when a reader comes to a book, when they want something, that is an expectation that is prior to the text. And I am interested in giving readers something that maybe they don't expect. I'm also, as a reader myself, not particularly interested in those types of books. So, I think that sometimes when we talk about writing or we talk about books, there is a particular type of reader who will say things like, it was like encountering a friend, when reading a book, or or that character was somebody who I just wanted to spend time with. And those are not the books and characters that I'm interested in. So I think that in terms of the sort of racial and gender grammar, that might be sort of in the back of my mind, certainly. But I think it belongs to a larger question of, expectations and wanting wanting writing to do something that's new, and thinking about innovation as being a particular type of geography.
Yeah.
Or, sorry, generosity. That was a weird Freudian slip.
And that kind of it's interesting, the thinking about not not addressing the reader's expectation is actually part of your understanding of the reader's expectation. I think that's kind of, those two go together, that you're actually very, very aware of the reader. I think the novel is very aware of the reader. Given that way of thinking, could you tell us about the publishing journey of the book then? Was it hard to sell a book like this? Was it what were the joys of selling a book like this?
Mm-hmm. Well, so I think that the thing about writing, right, is that, somebody asked me the other day about sort of how my reading and writing practice has changed under lockdown. And I think I disappointed them a little bit because I said it hadn't changed that much, except I maybe do it a little bit more. And so, for me, and I think that this is something that we alluded to a little bit earlier, I love that work every day.
Yeah.
And it's something that brings an immense sense of meaning to my life, and also a way of organizing my mind, my consciousness, remaining interested and sort of attending to the world, but focused. It's like it's just the best thing.
Yeah.
I
know. I feel bad when people ask me about it, because I go, yeah, I'm doing well. I'm writing. It's terrible.
Right. Yeah. It's just like, it's really cool.
This isolation is what I like. It's a bad thing to say. I said it in public though, but as an audience, it's good.
Right. So yeah, but oh my gosh, Kirby, our agent actually is here. He's gonna get. I hope I don't make Kirby mad. I know that there were people who definitely responded to the book in a way where they were a little bit suspicious, I guess, of the book, in the sense that they had a hard time understanding why I was writing it, because they didn't see how my autobiography fit with the book. And so, I do think that a lot of that has to do with the way that publishing writ large has tended to sort of misunderstand certain issues regarding diversity. maybe especially thinking about women of color, writing books that are sort of very flagrantly emotional and driven by either racialized pain or the experience of being within their particular culture, right? And so in terms of this book, I think that people were a little bit surprised because they're, you know, it's a very diverse cast of characters. There's a lot of characters. But I didn't feel like I needed to stay in my lane, let's say. I felt that just like a white man, I was qualified to write this story that had a sort of, you know, orchestral, large plot and large cast of characters, and to take on big intellectual questions. And that's what I did.
Yeah, yeah. And it's so important. I mean, a book like this is so important because it's just, you know, putting those stakes down, saying this is our work. This is the art that we're doing. It's really important that and I do think that the reviews, for instance, have been really good. I mean, you had the New York Times giving you that those beautiful blurbs. And so I do think that by continuing to do this this kind of work, you're just creating more of that ground that we know women are supposed to be doing this. We know that all that, not just, you know, the Don DeLillos of the world are going to be doing this, and we know that very well. So it's great. Should we go to questions or?
Let's go to questions.
Yeah, we can go to questions if there are any questions. I do have a few more questions, but if the audience is interested in a question, how does it work? Do we look at the question, or
we've got a question from the audience here. It says, how has teaching influenced your writing, if at all?
How has teaching influenced my writing, if at all? I don't know that it has.
Okay, great. Gina, back to you for more of your questions.
Yes, I have a few more. I mean, one of them, you know, just in terms of the issue of love in this novel, I was very moved by the novel's movements from the systems to intimacy, you know, that domestic world versus the huge dark web. You once said, a quote, "I think more robust privacy protections can in many cases give us the freedom to risk, amongst other things, love." I just thought that was a beautiful line. And I know that you talked about not being a writer who wants to have the person who's the friend and all of that. And yet there is in the novel, I mean, it packs a punch once you get to it. And it is about, in my view, a lot of it, it's about love. So could you talk a little bit about that, about privacy, surveillance, love?
Sure. Yeah. So I think, you know, oh my gosh, I could go on about this forever. So I'm going to try to keep this brief.
No, it's really the hardest
like
thing.
Small examples. Let's see. All right. So, you know, one of the things that I think about a lot is that privacy can give us a pocket of space to experiment and take risks. And so for some, you know, I think that one example that we can sort of look at right now, right, would be in education, right? So right now we're in a pandemic. Kids are online, taking classes online, and there's a way in which there is a new set of risks that presents itself, and a new type of publicness that presents itself that can be, I think, very chilling to the ability of people in these classes, kids and adults, right, to speak freely and openly and experiment with ideas prior to worrying about what the response will be, how it will be interpreted, how their answer will be distributed in some way. The notion of both the temporal aspect, so the potential permanence of particular forms of discourse living online, but also the scalability of the distribution of that communication to many people, is a great deal of pressure, right? And so in the question of love, intimacy, and not just romantic love, but also other forms of love. I'm thinking about the way in which we do need, safe spaces in a way to be able to make those sort of emotional leaps. And also, I would even say that about self-love too, that, one of the questions that I think the book is interested in grappling with is the way in which living our lives in a way where we do feel so seen almost makes selfhood into an object outside of the self that then is always being regarded by the self as, as it lives. And that itself can be very, I think, damaging and make it very difficult for people to, I hate the term self-love, but love oneself, right? Because I think there's a lot of self-consciousness there. I certainly see it or believe that I observe that in my peers. So yeah, I don't know if that really answers the question. But yeah.
We've got some more questions from the audience. Why is systems thinking important? How is system different than the global for you?
That's a really great question, Paul. Hi, Paul. Okay, well, so I will say first of all that I think that thinking about systems is extremely important to me. And I think that this, partially this is very American of me, because so often I think that when we approach problems that are larger social, political, cultural problems, we believe that we can individually sort of fix them or use our agency to somehow, be the solution. And when we look at questions like surveillance or these larger problems of the fracturing of authority, those are not things that we can merely do alone. We can certainly participate in, contribute to resisting, but me using, say, DuckDuckGo as my browser instead of using, Google Chrome is not going to sort of reconfigure systems of surveillance. And one of the things that I think is sort of implicit in offering up a systemic critique is the notion that we need to radically change these systems, and that they're extremely complicated, and they're not just things that we can go about doing ourselves day to day. I was asked recently about sort of like tips about privacy, especially online. And I appreciate, this sentiment. And I certainly think that, we should all do our best about that. But I also think that there's a way in which we can blame ourselves for some of these problems when that is not actually appropriate. So for example, Shoshana Zuboff talks in Surveillance Capitalism about the way in which people think they can opt out. And you can't necessarily opt out because you'll see something like, I'm like losing my mind not thinking of the term, the fine print, right? And, the fine print on a lot of things, a lot of technologies that we use today are such that it would take, say, 3 weeks or 6 weeks, to read it for one given technology, right? Those are the sorts of things that companies do in order to actually prevent us from being able to individually resist. So I'm really interested in systems because I do think that we need to sort of think about collective action, and we need to also think about the way in which actions sort of operate like chess, that things that we think that we're doing or not doing are not sort of sufficient to, we can't just sort of look at a very simple physics, right? It's much more complicated. So, and the other question you asked, how is system different than global for you? I think, to be honest, I'm not sure I completely understand the question, so I'm going to try to do my best. But I think that, when we're thinking about systems, right, these are produced, right? They're produced by people. But they end up sort of operating in a way in which there's an aura of them being naturalized and not being understood always as sort of synthetic, right? Whereas I don't think I can answer the question. I'm sorry. I think I don't understand it. Paul, I'm sorry. You can rephrase, or we could just do another question. I'm sorry. I don't have a good answer.
Let's go to another question. Let's see. Do you feel like, this is from Adam, do you feel like you answered your questions that you set out to when you began the book? Or how much did the questions change from when you began to when you finished?
It's a beautiful question.
That is a beautiful question. I think that, when you're writing a novel, one of the things that you might be doing also is offering questions for other people to play with. And I think of this novel as being one that I hope does raise questions for people. There are things that I still maybe am thinking about with the characters now. But I don't know that I necessarily wrote the book to answer questions, if that makes sense. I think I wrote the book to sort of raise the way that these questions operate in our lives, motivate us, so on and so forth.
Great. Let's see. This is from Pamela. Aside from Snowden's revelations, did you have any personal experience of losing privacy that fed into this novel?
No, but I do have a friend who is often accidentally screenshotting her own text messages to send to somebody and then sending it to the wrong person, and we joke about it all the time.
Okay. And this one is from Mark. He says, "Hi, Tracy. The novel contains a great number of focalized or POV characters. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about the process of developing these characters?"
Sure. Yeah. So there were even more at one point, and I scaled back. So, Jeremy was really the first one, and Alexandra the second, but they were, basically characters that came up with around the same time. Alexandra was was difficult for me in a lot of ways to develop as a character, because she makes very different life choices. She has very different values than I do. And I needed to sort of wrap my mind around her. And that really took a long time. Like, I think in early drafts, she was thinner. And so, Tyrell is a character who comes up later in the book, and he's probably my favorite character. I really liked working on him. In some ways, he was the character that I felt most connected to. He's a young boy. He's like, the youngest character in the book besides the son of Jeremy and Alexandra Hahn. And he's really into sports. He sometimes has a little bit of trouble spitting out what he wants to say. He has a close relationship with his mother. He doesn't always understand things about what she wants of him. And one of the things that was important in this novel in terms of thinking about surveillance, not just like, technological surveillance, but also, as I said, in-person surveillance, and the way that those two meet. So Tyrell's mom is sort of under surveillance, as a Black mom. I think she's under a little bit of extra surveillance. And one of the things that I did want to get at in this book was the way in which these systems, which appear to be sort of equalizers or neutral or whatever, are still ones that often will be more harmful for people at the margins. And so one of the things, an important part of the plot for Tyrell is the way in which his mom is sort of her parenting is being a little bit surveilled, and he's being a little bit surveilled as a potentially at-risk child, as a young Black man, or a young Black boy rather. So yeah. Actually, I'm not sure if that was really the question that was being asked, but in terms of developing the voice, I do think that each of those characters is, does have a distinct voice, or I hope so. So yeah.
Okay, this one is from Peter. In a world in which everyone, hang on a sec. And in a world in which everyone is interconnected, is there room for the one-to-one relation that is traditional romantic love, leaving aside arrangements like those of family, nuclear, extended, or polyamory?
Well, oh, man, you guys are asking hard questions. I'm getting hot. You're stressing me out. Yeah, no, sure. Yeah, there's room for that. I ended up dedicating, or doing a little dedication thing in the final copy of the book, and it was the book was dedicated to those who wish. I'm sorry. Basically, I was trying to get at the way in which we could think of closeness as much more capacious. And so I think that you're bringing up, Peter, a one-to-one relationship, and I do think that is possible, but I don't think that we're ever just in a one-to-one relationship, right? So, we don't get to live in vacuums, right? Except for, under a pandemic. So, there's room for, say, monogamy. There is room for, loving a person and having them be a primary partner. But I don't know that we can ever just approach a relationship as being one between two purely individuals as much as two individuals who are, in a substrate of a sociocultural context. that happens to be, quite networked.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Let's see. This one is from Mega. I'd love to ask about craft. What was a craft question that you felt was a challenge as you wrote this book, and how did you address it?
I think that the big one was pacing. Pacing and proportion, which they're intimately connected. So this question of narrative structure, how much time do you spend on particular things, moments, and because there is such a large cast of characters in this book, I needed very early on, or I felt that early on I needed to introduce a bunch of information, but also, of course, get a narrative tension established and beginning to move. And so I was really struggling to get a sense of momentum behind the beginning. And, to some extent, I still think about this. Like, the book is, it's in print, it's out of my hands. And sometimes I wake up still and I think, God, I could have reversed the order of, this short chapter and this other short chapter, and maybe it would have been faster, It's always in the back of my mind. So I'm not sure that I can't say that it was necessarily completely solved, but one thing that definitely did help it was, Mark Doughton, my editor, who's a brilliant writer and a wonderful person to talk to about writing, reminded me at some point that I had told him that I really love Joan Didion's political novels, which have extremely short chapters. And that made it sort of possible for me to think like, okay, I can reconfigure some of the organization of information here. I can get it into smaller chapters, make this move a little bit faster. So, yeah.
Great. And you might have talked about this a little bit, but let's see. Catherine has a question. Can you speak a little bit more about how your novel might speak to complicate the rapidly changing context in which we are thinking about surveillance due to the pandemic?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question one more time?
Sure. Can you speak a little bit more about how the novel might fit into the context, the rapidly changing context in which we are thinking about surveillance due to the pandemic?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of issues of surveillance right now, and to be fair, there are many areas that I need to learn more about before I can sort of offer like a really substantive critique. But, I will say that like one example would be contact tracing. Contact tracing is something that I personally have a lot of questions about, and I think represents some of the challenges that we face with surveillance in terms of the way in which the benefits need to be weighed against, potential drawbacks or misuses. So right now, we have spoken about the way in which contact tracing might be very useful for curbing the pandemic, right? Figuring out, where places can open, right? Or, how the virus itself is moving. On the other hand, this is really only going to be something that works out if it is one in which privacy, people's sort of sensitive health information, right, is very closely guarded, and where that information is not going to be used for other purposes. And that has not always been the case in instances in which sensitive information is gathered about people. It also represents another major problem in the way in which our politics interacts with our sense of what is information. And so, for example, there was a poll done recently where 68% of Democrats said that they would participate in CDC contact tracing. Then only 32% of Republicans said that they would be willing to do that. So it also represents this polarization that creates problems in surveillance too. So, yeah.
Okay. So we've got one more question from the audience, and that is, would you, and this is if you're ready for this, would you please read more from the novel if you have a favorite passage that you want to share?
Oh, well, maybe we can just end on like a sort of pleasant note. I think it's so often talking about systems of surveillance can seem so bleak, But yeah, okay. So I'm just gonna read like a very short bit. Then I wouldn't necessarily say this is my favorite because actually I kind of like the fraught. The fraught bleak parts, but I'll just read this little bit because maybe it'll leave us on a slightly feeling better note. Chapter 3, part 1. So this is right after the 7/7 attacks. So this is the chapter right after the one that I had read before. In the nights after the underground bombings, they clutched and they were alive. Fortunately, wonderfully alive. Alexandra told him he was too far when they were next to each other. In the mornings, because she'd admitted which she was too impatient to enjoy, Jeremy removed pomegranate seeds from the husk, and because she did not want him to first think to discard the imperfect thing, she fussed a small screwdriver to repair his watch, though always it was breaking. When they watched a movie, he asked after if the gladiator would live, and no matter the quality, she declared the warrior's future thrive. She began to pay attention to men's shirts in shop windows, cufflinks. They had met in May, and now it was July, and as days ticked off, the calendar grew suggestive. I've seen you more than the inside of my own refrigerator this week. You know that? Alexandra said. A dry goods woman, are you? Just north, Alexandra said. Freezer. That's the one shaped like a boot? It's an intemperate country, but you'd be surprised at the idols, she said. Food never spoils, and there is no fever, war, or taxation. Her foot was in his hand. I will levy no impost, he said, but I cannot speak for the food. That afternoon, he noticed that she paper-clipped magazine pages to keep her place. He remarked on it. Later, when she removed an issue from her overnight bag, she found a note clasped where she left off reading. Have a drink with me, or have a museum with me. Have tea. Am I allowed only one? She wrote on the blank side of her receipt. And when after a week he did not find her small letter, she did not tell him its contents, but she did invite him to meet her best friend. At the bar, over glasses of whiskey and ice furnished with regular fleet, Jeremy removed and layered clothing, muttering, too warm, too cold. He reiterated what she'd told him of Genevieve Bailey in the form of questions. Did Genevieve still prefer for different foods not to touch? And was it true that she preferred to write in pencil? It is true, Genevieve told him. I like him, Genevieve told her. Once, Alexandra would have, on the occasion of bringing him flowers, said she was bringing his house flowers. Less to lose then, less frightening. Now she asked, can we be trusted to raise a houseplant? He brought home 2 kittens. The Abyssinian they named Jill, the all-black So-So. The shell-pink felt of the pads on their paws shocked the sequester of her where careful language stacked. Modular, ready-made. They lay on the carpet, jouncing shoelaces, and she made fool noises. That's it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gina and Tracy. Congratulations on your release day. Everybody, it's a time for authors to have books coming out. So use that button and buy a dozen copies of her book and send it to everybody you know. We're so grateful for all of you joining us, and we'll see you again in the new virtual event space another time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie. Thank you, Center. Okay. Bye.